now. Yes, so again, sort of good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us. We had an overwhelming amount of interest in this session, and we're really, really pleased, considering this isn't actually the session that's part of the SCAR 2020 lineup. So for those of us who joined us, we actually have another session, which is more of a workshop, and that'll take place on the 4th of August. I'll include the details about that in the closing remarks of this session. So session 45 came about mostly from the work done by Morgan Sieg, who laid all the groundwork and put forward the abstract for a session that looked at inclusive collaborations. So Morgan Ranucca from the European Polar Board and I co-authored a paper in February of last year is when we wrote it, and it came out in December of 2019, which basically introduced this idea of applying Kimberlé Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality to the way that we look at women in polar research. And we didn't expect it to be as well received as it was. And we realized that there really is a willingness for people in polar research communities to have conversations that are more complex, more nuanced, and more varied about intersectionality, about different kinds of inclusivity. And that's how this session was born. So we asked the community to send us abstracts for the session, and we've honestly been overwhelmed by just the sheer quality of the abstracts that we received, and in many ways bringing this session online in two parts, half of it today with oral and poster presentations, and the other half with the remaining oral and poster presentations on the 4th, as well as some breakout discussions and some panels. We've been able to really do more than I think we could have done if this had been in person in Hobart. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our first speaker. Adrian, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Is that showing up as the screen?
It is indeed.
I will do a slideshow. Okay, well, thank you very much for including me in this presentation. I'd prepared a little bit of a more formal talk, but given the time constraints, I'll just go through this a little bit more informally. But the main aim of this paper is to suggest that the McMurdo Dry Valleys region of Antarctica is a really good place for thinking about some of these themes of inclusion and diversity in Antarctic science, going right back to the early 20th century and the so-called heroic era expeditions. So starting with an expedition that went into the Dry Valleys in 1911, Griffith Taylor's Western Sledge Journey. And I haven't got time to say much about this, but Taylor was a really interesting figure, a very careful observer of the Antarctic landscape. And towards the end of his time in the Dry Valleys, he reported a dream that he had in Antarctica. And I'll let you read this for yourselves. But it's a very odd comment. It suggests a lot of imperial anxiety. There are some clear racial undertones to this idea, the fear of the Japanese in Antarctica, but also more generally at the time. Purely coincidentally, about 50 years later, the Japanese came to no connection at all to Taylor's dream, but the Japanese have played a major role in the history of science in the McMurdo Dry Valleys, largely through the person of Tetsuya Tori. And I've just prepared a little bar chart of the contributions of different nations year by year to Antarctic science in the McMurdo Dry Valleys. And you can see from the colors, the majority of research since the 1960s has come from New Zealand and the United States. But in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the Japanese played a major role. And one of the things that comes out quite clearly in this history is that the Japanese researchers in the McMurdo Dry Valleys faced a number of challenges, faced racial prejudice in a variety of ways. And I think the Dry Valleys are an interesting location for thinking about how this actually impacts science happening in Antarctica. I also wanted to just acknowledge, and I think very importantly, that there's also really histories of gender and class happening alongside the history of race in the Dry Valleys. And I think this is where there's some very interesting work to be done on the intersectionality of this. And Morgan Sieg, who is one of the, as Ikra said, is one of the organizers of this panel, has done some really interesting work on this woman, Lois Jones, who in the 1969-1970 season led the first female expedition to the Dry Valleys. And it had to be an all-female expedition. There were a number of reasons for that. But sadly, in many ways, this was her only research in Antarctica. She only went down for one season. This was after doing her PhD at Ohio State University. And thinking about some of the reasons for this, I think there's a clear sense of a macho culture of Antarctic science in the 1960s and 1970s and 80s in the Dry Valleys. This was some work we were doing, a repeat photography project, but you get a sense of the gender dynamics from the picture on the left here. So this sort of sense of hostile environment, discriminating against people who aren't part of the sort of in club. And this was epitomized in the Vanda Station, which was the main New Zealand station. Here, there was a very hard drinking culture. The Vanda Swim Club was all about swimming naked in this frozen lake. And sometimes, as you can see from this quote, combining the two things at once. So I think this really functioned to sort of dissuade people who weren't part of this club into Antarctic science. And there's also a history of class going back to Taylor and Evans. I won't say anything more about this, but just to acknowledge that it's all three of these. So the main story I wanted to tell was the story of the Japanese, and the researchers in the Dry Valleys tended to be physically distanced from the main New Zealand research station. Despite some really interesting scientific discoveries, Torrey, for example, was the person to identify and describe Antarcticite, the first mineral to be discovered or identified in Antarctica, in the continent of Antarctica. And initially he wanted to call this Don Juanite after the pond. And I think there's an element here that helps us to sort of recognize some of the challenges by non-English language speakers, particularly speakers of languages such as Japanese, that recognizing the nuances of the language, operating in an environment that has been given English language names is very difficult. So they settled on Don Juanite. There was a coming together in terms of parties, Christmas, New Year parties at Vanda Station, some great images of this that we have collected. But in general, and this is some of the work we've been doing with social network analyses using the scientific publications of the Dry Valleys, we see the Japanese research group at the bottom corner of this graph or diagram in purple, largely separate and largely disconnected from the main webs and networks of Dry Valley science. So one of the things I'd like to suggest is that we have an example here where we can see the impact of prejudice on the actual science that takes place in the region. Towards the end of the Japanese research period in the 1980s, they did actually move closer and into Vanda Station. But despite this, and despite providing a lot of funds for example, a new laboratory at Vanda Station, there was still this implicit and sometimes explicit prejudice coming out of that we see in this scientific report about the expectations and the sort of attitudes towards the Japanese party staying there. So the bigger paper asks the question, why is it that we have seen an increasing gender diversity in McMurdo Dry Valley science over the last 30 years? But in some ways we've seen racial diversity go the opposite direction with the absence of the Japanese or the removal of the Japanese. There's also an important story of the exclusion of minority groups from both the New Zealand and the US program that would be important to go into. So I think basically my story is that the dry valleys give us a history where we can sort of really dig into this, look at some of the implications for science, and ask questions that do combine some of these ideas about race, gender, and class. So in some ways, a successful story, but in other ways, a less successful one. And why do we see it in this? Why did it develop in this particular way as we start to ask questions for the present? I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That was fascinating. I just want to encourage attendees to use either the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask questions to our presenters. I'm wary of the fact that we have a lot of presentations to get through, so I'm hoping that if you can include your comments and your questions in the chat or in the Q&A more widely, we can address them in between presentations. Does anyone have any questions for Adrian burning off the top of their heads right now? I think I've given everybody permission to speak, so we might get some wires crossed, but let's see if we can get any questions in. Hugh, I can see you and you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you think that the dry valleys are a special case, or if you compare them to somewhere like King George Island, which is a lot more international on the other side of Antarctica, would you see something similar in terms of collaboration or interaction, or would you expect those kind of different countries to be more separate, even though there's more diversity in King George Island, for example?
That's a really good question. And one of the things I like about the dry valleys is you can actually, so the social network analysis that we've done was based on 2,700 publications that were produced, and we know they were dry valleys. I think you could probably do something quite similar in a place like King George Island because it's a discrete, bounded region. And that would be a really interesting study to do, to think about how different groups there are interacting with each other. Potentially, given the more international nature of it, I might expect a little bit more collaboration. In the dry valleys, you have a very clear environment that is sort of established and named. And yeah, one of the, my larger paper looks at some of Catherine Yusuf's ideas about white geology and in the Billion Black Anthropocenes and None. But I think this is a case study where the attitudes and ideas of imperial science or imperialism get built into the science and the way the dry valleys are understood and named and even claimed by New Zealand. That is a little bit less the case, arguably, in somewhere like King George Island, where geopolitically it's disputed. Names perhaps aren't quite so English language only. And so there's more openness for different countries and different backgrounds to come in and collaborate. But that would be a really interesting comparative study.
Do we have any more questions? Right, I can't see anything in the Q&A in the chat just yet, but if you have any questions for Adrian, please do. Oh, we've got one here. It says, thank you, Adrian. Was the network analysis slide about joint publications? I'm asking because Japanese scholars in social anthropology, at least, often state that publications often come out in Japanese language, and thus the audience is a domestic one. These colleagues tried to connect more strongly to international audiences by increasingly publishing English. And that's sort of specifically from the early 2000s onwards, perhaps already earlier. Is that something that your research took into account?
Yeah, so it does, if I understand the question, it measures co-authorship. So who are the authors on any given publication, and Japanese publications are often co-authored as well, but it tends to be co-authored with other Japanese scholars. Those are often in Japanese. They tend to have an English language abstract, which helps us to do this work. There also, there's been a lot of bibliography work done on the dry valleys, particularly by the New Zealand Antarctic program. So we have access to Japanese language literature in a way that perhaps is more difficult in other places. So clearly language is a reason why we see the sort of on the edge of the network, that's one reason that they're publishing together, because it's language challenges of integrating into the English language. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that as well.
Thank you, Adrian. I think those are all the questions that have come in so far. So I'd like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Hannah Nielsen. Hannah, if you could check if you can show your screen, and we'll begin.
All right, thank you, Ikra. Kia ora, hello, I'm recording today, talking to you from Hobart. So I'd like to acknowledge the Muinina and Palawa people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land here on which our campus is built, and pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging. I'm presenting some work that was undertaken by me and Associate Professor Meredith Nash, who's also here in this session. And we're also happy to share the links to the papers that have been published out of this project here as well. But we're looking at Me Too in the Antarctic context. Now, whether researchers are based on vessels, national stations, or remote Antarctic field camps, fieldwork plays a really important role in knowledge creation. But women in STEM are 3.5 times more likely to experience sexual harassment during fieldwork as compared to men. And that harassment can take many forms, be it ethnic, gender, generalised workplace, or sexual harassment. Sexual harassment often gets a lot of the focus. But that remote environment can really magnify those effects as well. And that's particularly the case in a remote environment like Antarctica. So in 2017, we began a study exploring how women experience Antarctic fieldwork and research. That was through had gone down with the Australian National Program. And sexual harassment was a really key theme that came out, with 63% of the women in our study reporting having been sexually harassed in the field. And most of those people were early career researchers or field assistants. So I was thinking about those power dynamics. And of those, about half took no action. And around the same time that we were doing that project, so in October 2017, the Antarctic science community had its own Weinstein moment, with Science publishing a piece reporting that geoscientist Dr. Jane Willenbring and several other women had accused their former Boston University PhD supervisor, Professor David Marchant, of sexual harassment during Antarctic research field trips in the late 90s and early 2000s. And following an 18-month investigation in April 2019, Marchant's employment was terminated, and that glacier that had carried his name was also renamed. But that Marchant case is not unique in that the harassment of women and other marginalised groups in STEM is an enduring problem. So we took an interdisciplinary feminist approach to assessing the impact of the Me Too movement in Antarctic science. In doing that, we wanted to move away from a focus on individual cases and instead delve deeper into the factors that allowed that perfect storm of conditions to allow that sort of behaviour to manifest. So to do that, we looked at historical, cultural, and relational factors that sit beneath Me Too in Antarctic science, looking to provide a more nuanced approach to structural change. So in terms of historical factors, tales of masculine endeavour do continue to influence the ways that Antarctica is viewed today, as iconic Antarctic images of heroic explorers like Shackleton and Mawson continue to circulate. So Antarctica cast very much as a place for these masculine feats or as a remote feminised landscape. But for much of history, women were denied access to that continent. That access has been uneven, dependent very much on national policies. And that historic absence of women on the ice does provide important context for contemporary organisational experiences in Antarctic research and for polar science more broadly. It's really important to take that into account. It's also really important to be considering cultural factors as well, and identity politics in polar science. And identity politics are not always acknowledged in science more generally. But in terms of when we're looking at what can that look like, we've got the global underrepresentation of women in STEM, that leaky pipeline effect, with 45.8% of postgraduates in those STEM fields being women, but only 20.6% of those senior STEM leaders. And science is very deeply entwined with masculinity. The traits of a good scientist implicitly associated with that masculinity when scientists are perceived as highly agentic and career-driven, aligning with those stereotypic masculinic characteristics of things like independence, intelligence, and assertiveness. So that can play a role there as well. We've also seen a lot of focus on gender, not so much on intersectionality, which of course is something that will be discussed in this session here. But we don't know, for instance, how people of colour experience polar fieldwork. That's also to do with the problem of privilege in organisations. And we've got an assumption of meritocracy, that everyone can succeed no matter what, that identity doesn't matter, which is very important to address that. So looking at what are these cultural factors here. And I've got the Polar Pride logo up in the corner as well. Of course, back in 2018, really addressing those issues of safety and visibility for that LGBTIQ+ within Polar Research, a really important organisation. We've also got relational factors at play here too. And in that case, we're talking about power imbalances. A lot of the hierarchical nature of relationships inside scientific research and higher education institutions also plays out in the field. So you're reliant on supervisors for things like funding, fieldwork, and mentoring. And Dr. Jane Willenbring waited until she had a tenured position, for instance, nearly 17 years after her last Antarctic expedition with Professor Marchant to report that harassment, because that was the point when she was no longer worried that could ruin the career. So making a complaint can be to become the location of the problem. There's also unacknowledged emotional labour associated with making a complaint. You know, having to determine, is that complaint justified? For instance, is being grabbed on the bottom by a male colleague worthy of an investigation? And in the context of remote fieldwork, it's very difficult to physically absent yourself from that place. You can't leave for weeks or months. So in our survey, we had people bringing this up, saying, I didn't think to report it at the time. When you're working 16 hours a day in a remote location, the general theme is to move on and get on with the work rather than make more work for yourself or for others. So what does that mean practically? There's a real need to recognise intersectionality and for greater inclusivity in science and research cultures. Individuals, particularly the leaders of projects and teams, can play a role there. So that reflection, scientific communities reflecting on their histories, is an important step to making that Antarctic fieldwork safer and inclusive. It is just the start, but also incorporating those structured dialogues about identity and unequal power relation into pre-departure training can help. If you're in charge of a project, you can be seeing that this is there in your protocols. But the point here really is that we need to be thinking about the structural elements of this issue and what can be done by institutions in order to change that wider culture of field work. So including that information on harassment and pre-deployment safety training, along with your general first aid, for instance. Changing the image and culture of fieldwork, so making the range of people involved more visible. So this is also somewhere where national Antarctic programs can have a role to play, also in publicity material. And accounting for diverse sexual and gender identities and adopting best practices for ensuring safety and inclusion, but also making sure that it's not just a veneer, but is also very much values-based and is going right down to the roots of that organisation. So changing wider culture does require global institutional commitment to fostering cultural change in Antarctic research communities. I would say that intersectionality, as Crenshaw envisaged it, does have the potential to transform how we think about sexual harassment in STEM, but this does require that global institutional commitment to fostering that change. And that means that at the end of the earth, Me Too is needed more than ever. We're very happy to be contacted here and to address any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was fascinating. I'm going to make use of my chair's privilege here and ask the first question, if that's okay. So one of the things that you touched on is this idea of needing a cultural change. And I think in some of the conversations that I've been having recently about how to best go about encouraging institutions to start making changes, is that the first step really seems to be acknowledging that there's a problem in the first place. And I was wondering to what extent the work that you and Meredith have done has has made you realize what barriers there are to sort of that first step, and if you have any recommendations for how people can go about starting to have those conversations based on your research. Not a small question, I know.
Yeah, maybe I'll start, and then Meredith, if you've got something to say to that, you could come into. I think that's a really good point, having those conversations, but that's not always something that is talked about, particularly within science. It is something that comes up a lot sort of with social scientists, for instance. Some of these concepts are just very much taken for granted that that's how it is, but some of that interrogation of how things are, and just also what are those privileged positions that are going on as well. The history of science is an area of research in its own right, but I think it's something that's really important also for any scientists who are sort of coming up through their training to have some awareness of too. There's a lot written on sort of those, not just the sexist histories, but sort of racist histories as well, and assumptions that are there. So acknowledging that is a really important first step. But talking to sort of experts from outside of your area, it's not always that, if you're a glaciologist, that it will be the glaciologist that will know how to help you with that. So also broadening out and recognizing other expertise too, but that being open is really important. And that's also something that we see a lot with some of the early career organizations. I've seen having some of these conversations too, organizations like Apex, which is a really great place to start, but then it's also important for some of those more senior researchers to be open to some of these ideas that maybe they didn't come across in their earlier training. But Meredith, do you have something to add?
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Eva. I mean, I think the most important point to remember in the context of these discussions is that equity is a process, it's not a product. And that actually, in order for us to foster inclusion, you have to have belonging first. And so, it is really challenging to get people to shift their mindset and to acknowledge that there's a problem. But I think that our earlier point about encouraging critical conversations and finding ways for institutions to facilitate those so that people can feel like their experiences are seen, and that they are seen as, field workers or as employees or whatever, students. That actually is the most fundamental step before you can start thinking about what initiative is going to work.
Brilliant. And with that, I'd like to ask if the audience has any further questions for Hannah and Meredith.
We're happy to share those links as well to those papers in the chat box, and yeah, also just useful to keep thinking of Antarctica as a workplace too as we go forward.
Absolutely, thank you. Please do share those links. Yeah, as always, we would love to have the discussion continuing in the chat box. So please feel free to ask questions of previous speakers. I'm sure we can carry on that discussion. Similarly, a lot of the speakers have shared their contact details with their slides. So if you don't have a question just yet, but you'd like to continue the conversation afterwards, we would really encourage that. Yeah, and I'd like to invite Dr. Hugh Griffiths next to talk about Pride in Polar Research. So Hugh, whenever you're ready.
Brilliant. Hopefully you can now see this poster I put up on the screen. It is only a poster, so I'm only going to talk for a couple of minutes, but I just want to thank Steve Roberts for designing this amazing poster, because it kind of captures everything that we were trying to capture, but without too many words. Pride in Polar Research, many of you were probably there at the beginning, but if you weren't, it started in 2018 at a SCAR conference. So it's very fitting that 2 years later, we're already at a stage where we can show some things that we've done. And it comes, interestingly, and I think it's a really important message, that it came out of one early career scientist's experiences and their initiative to actually ask for a meeting and actually ask for help. So one person triggered, and that Alex Elliott won't mind me telling you that it's Alex, but it's really Alex Thornton, sorry, really triggered an entire thing of people who were in a relatively privileged position like myself, realizing that just because I'm okay and I don't see any obvious effects of homophobia or any of the other kind of phobias that come along with this group, doesn't mean that everything's okay in polar science. And that was a big awakening for a lot of people to have somebody reaching out because they needed help to fight some battles. And I think from that, we've grown very quickly because it was recognized by lots of people that something needed doing. And these were including straight allies, which was really important to us as a group, that we didn't exclude the people that we were trying to influence the most. It needed to be a kind of everyone together moving forwards. And we've had huge support from all the organizations at the bottom of the poster. And one of the most important things for us actually was in this poster to show the diversity within the minority, if that makes sense. That you can't have a one size fits all answer for everything. It kind of comes under the whole thing as categorizing the other. We very often demean or reduce the diversity within the other. If we're always comparing to straight white males, everybody else is the other. And I think then a lot of people get lost in that as well. And that's one of the messages we picked up over the last couple of years, is that to recognize as many people as we can. We're never going to be getting it perfect, and we'll make mistakes sometimes, but actually to give as much of a platform to everybody rather than just the kind of best known elements of a minority. And we've been really helped. We've had people such as the Homeward Bound Expedition making a human LGBTQI plus flag. We've had Pride Day announced for South Georgia and the UK Antarctic territories, which we're hoping everybody else will join in with as well, because we don't want it to be a UK focused thing. And that'll be on the 18th of November. And we've had, I think we've given out over 3,000 pin badges now, including to some very influential people in polar science, to make sure that they are aware that there is a movement, because that's one of the main things. And then we also send them information about how they can help or raise awareness for us. And then we're also feeding into loads of initiatives that you'll probably hear about today that help do something from this point onwards, because it's not just about flag waving. It is about helping to influence conference organizers, helping to influence educational areas, helping to just generally push the agenda forward. And I think if anyone's got any questions, it's probably best if I stop talking now and people can ask me about it if they want to.
Thank you, Hugh. Yeah, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Or if I scared everybody off.
Well, as always, if you have any questions for Hugh that you can't think of right now off the top of your head, please do pop them in the chat, and I'm sure Hugh, you can respond.
Yeah, and the poster will be up for the general poster session as well for SCAR. So if anybody wants the details or wants to get a copy or snapshot of the poster, you can get it from the main website.
Yes. Oh, Hugh, you've got some questions. So the first one is, what are the plans to celebrate the first Polar Pride Day this November?
So at the moment, because it was just announced, we're in touch with Pride in STEM, well, it's LGBTQI plus in STEM Day, who are now making it part of their official program as well. So it'll be kind of more open widely through that. But the UK and overseas territories government are sending Pride flags, and we've asked them to send the Progress Pride flag, which includes more minorities in the colours that it uses, to be flown on the UK bases. And where we're now starting to encourage people, if anybody is going south, despite the COVID situation, if they'd like to, if they're going to be down south during the 18th of November, to take a Pride flag with them, or at least some badges or something, and to display that publicly. And that we will be doing virtual events and things on the day as well, and trying to really push that as a big event for us.
Yeah, another question is, what does Pride and Polar Research have planned coming up in the next few months, perhaps?
So we're submitting posters to things like AGU with a special session in there, which is about minorities in polar science, so very similar to what we're doing here today. And also Arctic Net and other things in the Arctic have sessions where we're going to be putting posters. But we generally tend to have people on the ground in conferences, and to have a virtual conference is strange for us, but we had 2,000 badges ready to come to SCAR to give out, for example, and to have a banner and posters and everything there. So it's a bit strange to be. Sorry. Oh. Yeah. So we've got lots coming up, but if anyone's got any suggestions of things they'd like us to help with or attend, or if they want to come up with their own ideas, we're always listening.
Oh, we've got an interesting question there for you, Hugh, saying, considering research institutions, are we running through open doors, and where do you meet open resistance, if any?
It's really interesting. So within polar science, there has been a very vocal women in polar research movement that has been very well supported. But this year was the first time I ever heard a director of the British Antarctic Survey say the word LGBTQ. And it's never been mentioned before. So although when you go to an HR department or you go to a secretariat or something, they all say the right things, nothing's really changed in the 20 years I've been doing polar research. There's been this kind of tolerance rather than acceptance or inclusion, and we don't discuss it. And it's kind of very old school and very, very Antarctic, I guess. It's that kind of military background to a lot of the Antarctic programs means if you don't tell, and then we don't have to deal with it. And I think now that's changing, but I think cultural differences around the world will make it, because we're an international organization, my experiences in the UK will be very different to some people in their own universities and things in other countries.
Amazing, thank you again, Hugh. I would like to now invite Dr. Maddie Brazier to present our next talk. Maddie, if you could try sharing your screen. When you're ready.
How's that? Sorry, I managed to share but didn't manage to unmute. So, can you hear me now?
Perfectly, thank you.
Awesome. So I'd just like to say that I'm also presenting from Hobart today, and I'd like to thank Hannah for acknowledging the traditional owners of this land that we're presenting from today, and continue that through this talk. This talk will be summarising a manuscript that got accepted for publication today in a special research topic in Frontiers in Marine Science, and we've dedicated this manuscript to Adrian Dahoud, who was a great polar early career researcher and very passionate about Antarctic conservation. So our paper basically summarises some perspectives and lessons from early career researchers involved in the marine ecosystem assessment for the Southern Ocean project. And we highlight some of the obstacles faced by early career researchers and how we might overcome these. So for those of you who haven't heard of the Marine Ecosystem Assessment for the Southern Ocean project, which I will refer to as MESO throughout this talk, it's an international collaboration that really kicked off in April in 2018 when there was a conference in Hobart. And the aims of MESO was basically to assess the status and trends of Southern Ocean habitats, species and ecosystems. And this involved a lot of researchers from different areas of Antarctic science, as well as stakeholders and policymakers. And the outcomes are a special issue in Frontiers in Marine Science, as well as a future review paper and a summary for policymakers that will feed into organisations such as the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. Now, ECRs had, and when I say ECRs, I'm referring to early career researchers sort of within 5 years of their terminal degree. And they had various different roles in the MESO project, from being on the organisation committee. They also contributed hugely to a Southern Ocean wiki page. Some of us attended international workshops, both in person and remotely. We had a Twitter page going that a lot of ECRs contributed content to. And then quite a few of us ended up being either lead authors or co-authors on the papers in the special issue, of which there are about, I think there's between 15 and 20 papers. And these data here, these are presented in the paper, and it gives you a breakdown of where our ECRs and also mid-career researchers came from. So mid-career being 6 to 10 years post-PhD, where they came from around the world, and sort of how many we had percentage-wise on the manuscript. So on average, we had about nearly around 19% of authors on each paper were ECRs, and about 15% mid-careers. So in our paper, we had 3 key aims, and the first one was sort of looking at the benefits of ECR involvement in large research projects such as MESO. And just kind of for speed here, these are just some of the benefits that the ECRs felt they gained from meso. And one that was particularly common that some people kind of said was a bit unusual was the interaction with policy and industry there. And some of you may be looking at this and thinking, you know, a lot of these are quite common from other large research projects you've been involved with, but we just sort of really wanted to point it out to ECRs that are perhaps a bit on the bench about getting involved in these kind of things, the opportunities they might gain. Now our paper, our author group was about 17 of us, and we also wanted to consider some of the obstacles as to why some ECRs may not have been involved in the meso project or may have dropped out of the meso project partway through. And as our paper went through the review process, it really came to the surface that a lot of these obstacles were true of other research disciplines, not just Antarctic science, and also at times just sort of science in general as well. So we have in the revisions made it some of our language a bit broader. But these were our obstacles here, and yeah, it'd be good to know if people have faced these obstacles themselves, or if they've seen their colleagues or students face these obstacles, and to try and kind of give some actions rather than just sort of pointing out the problems. We've got a couple of, we've got a summary table in our paper where in the text we've defined the obstacles, and then in the tables we've put some key actions there that could be taken at the individual, or sorry, by the individual or at the institutional level or within the research community to try and address these obstacles. And we've also given examples where the meso project perhaps tried to prevent these obstacles from affecting involvement. So this is just one of them there, but the full table is in the paper, and there's also a supplementary table with where we've divided up individual, institute and research community into separate columns, and there's much more detail and much more explanation there. And then the final aim of our paper was kind of bringing it back to Antarctic science and thinking about science moving forward and the role that ECRs could have in the future of Antarctic science. And our combined opinion was that there is this sort of shifting research culture towards interdisciplinary collaborations, and also the importance of communicating Antarctic science with stakeholders and policymakers. And we felt that as ECRs, we're really being encouraged to use these different communication skills and to gain these different kind of experiences, which will help us kind of step into this role in the future. We also highlighted that at the moment, there's a lot of sort of new strategic planning going on in terms of new ships and modifications to stations and that sort of thing. And a lot of these plans are looking 30 years ahead in the future. And it's really important to engage ECRs in these plans now, as in 30 years time, hopefully it's going to be us that will be using these ships and visiting these stations. And then we also just kind of plugged at the end that in order for us to stick around, we do need support. We can take a lot of individual action, but we can't do it all on our own. So that's basically it. Yeah, just wanted to sort of thank the meso community, you guys for listening in, and also the co-authors on the paper. It was an interesting one for us to pull together, and we hope that what we've highlighted will be useful to some ECRs out there.
I realised I had muted myself, apologies. Thank you, Maddie. I really found that fascinating, and I'd like to open up the floor to questions for Maddie, either through the chat or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask.
I've got a question.
Go for it.
So, Maddie, you listed a lot of the kind of barriers almost to early career participation in things. It's basically, do you list also the real solutions to how to get past those barriers, or is that something you're still trying to identify in terms of whether anything's in meso that really were different to the way anybody else is doing things that can help early career people move past those barriers?
Yeah, so we so that's where the actions came into play. Really, we were sort of throwing out suggestions for how they could help people overcome these obstacles. So it may not be, you know, there may not be one perfect single solution, but we gave combined ideas of how people could tackle them. We highlight in the paper, MISO wasn't perfect for ECRs. It still had, you know, there were a couple of things that came up that weren't great for ECRs. But I think one of the things I personally, and I think quite a few of the co-authors found with MISO, was that we did have a lot of direct engagement with stakeholders and policymakers, which I haven't had so much in previous large projects. So it kind of broadened our outlook on where the research was going. I think that was one of the sort of key differences for some of us.
Thank you. I was nodding along and realised my picture's not up, so it doesn't help you to know that actually I was agreeing with most of what you're saying.
That's all right. I can imagine it.
Do we have any more questions for Maddie? Right, I can't see anything in the chat, so I think we'll move on. Just to let everybody know, I think after the next poster presentation, we'll take a short break. I know that around the hour is when the SCAR business meeting begins, so I'm aware that a few folks might have to drop out for that. And if you want to rejoin afterwards, or please feel free to just sort of drop in and out as you need. So I was thinking we'll have this next presentation by Carrie, and then after that we'll take a short break so everyone can stretch their legs, maybe grab a coffee. And then we'll come back after that. So Carrie, if you're ready to share your screen. Fantastic, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Ikra. Let me. Okay, so I want to start by introducing APEX as an organization, though I see a lot of current and former APEX leadership on this call, so I think many of you are probably already familiar, but APEX is an international interdisciplinary network that provides high quality professional development opportunities to early career researchers interested in the polar and alpine regions and the wider cryosphere. So it stands for the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, although we do cater to a wider audience than just specifically the poles. And APEX works towards a future where one's identity is not a barrier to success in polar science. And kind of furthering this goal, in 2018, APEX introduced a project group on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so some of the authors of the original proposal for this group are on the call. So I just want to give them a shout out. Thanks for doing the legwork to get this started. So the goals of the group were to provide resources for APEX members facing identity-related challenges, as well as for allies and leaders within the APEX community and within the wider polar science community, to facilitate international interdisciplinary dialogue about DEI issues in polar research, and to promote DEI principles within the structure of APEX and related communities. And so just to give you a kind of sense of the breadth and reach of APEX, this map is showing you countries that have APEX presence in them. So across the globe, we have over 3,500 members from 73 countries. So shown in dark blue are countries that have APEX members, and then shown in orange are countries that have a formal national committee formed, which means they need to create a committee to begin with. You need to have at least 3 APEX members, and then some of these committees are developed into much larger groups than that. So I wanted to briefly go through a few of the early successes of this diversity working group that has existed for 2 years now, and then discuss some of the opportunities for improvement. So first, to address the resource creation, the APEX DEI group has curated a resource repository on the APEX website that currently hosts about 80 resources. It's updated regularly. Resources can be suggested on the website by members of the community, and this includes reading lists, inclusive networks, codes of conducts, best practices, and then relevant research articles and news publications. They have also authored a fieldwork code of conduct and bill of rights, which actually, after I made this poster, it has come out of external review and been formally published on our website. So you can find that there. And as an aside, all of the words that are in dark blue are links. So if you scan the QR code in the upper left-hand side of this poster, you will be taken to a downloadable version of this where you can click on all these links to access these either documents or web pages. Okay, so then to create dialogue within our community, the group has hosted 3 webinar-style panel discussions about inclusion over the last few years. Each one was attended live by about 90 early career researchers. They're also all archived on the Apex Vimeo channel to be available to the wider community. So the first topics were on how to address bias in professional relationships, working with Indigenous communities, and how polar agencies are changing their policies to become more inclusive. And so if any of you are interested in these topics, I'd encourage you to check out the Apex Vimeo page. And then also one thing the group did was to recruit mid to late career polar researchers with experience in the DEI realm to be available as mentors to early career scientists. So Apex already had maintained a mentor database on our website that just gives brief profiles of older researchers who are willing to be mentors for some newer researchers. And since 2011, this has facilitated the creation of about 30 mentor-mentee relationships. So obviously this is always a work in progress and there's always room for improvement. So some opportunities we see for improvement coming up in the next few years are to diversify the leadership, the upper leadership of Apex a little bit more. The majority of Apex presidents and executive committee members over the last 10 years have been from North America and Europe. So we see an opportunity to kind of help the upper leadership diversity reflect the geographic distribution of our members by actively recruiting leaders from regions that are underrepresented within our community. And then to also introduce formal inclusion and bias training for Apex leadership, which would include, we have about 100-person international council that does the bulk of the organization and work for Apex. Also, we see an opportunity with our mentorship database to develop that into a more formal mentorship program. We think this is important because effective mentorship has been shown to really accelerate career advancement for burgeoning scientists. So we're developing a formal mentorship program that might pair interested ECRs with interested mentors that meet their individual needs. And then finally, another area for improvement is to increase collaboration with our already existing large network of national committees to help provide appropriate resources for ECRs in different regions and make sure we're meeting the needs of all of our members, and then to disseminate more widely the Apex opportunities that already exist. And finally, we should also work to strengthen partnerships with other organizations and to amplify the work that they are doing within this space. There's a lot of other great early career networks in polar science. So we've already heard from one of them today, Pride in Polar Research, and then another up and coming one that some of you may have heard of is Polar Impact, or Minorities in Polar Research. And so finally, while we think that early career researchers and Apex have a role to play in making polar science more inclusive and welcoming, these efforts obviously need to be top down in addition to bottom up. So we hope that those with more institutional power will help address structural inequities and foster cultural change. So with that, thank you, everyone. I do want to give a shout out to all of the members of the Apex DEI group over the last 2 years, including those that wrote the original proposal. So thank you so much for that work, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So you've got a question already from Hannah asking, how do you account for different cultural backgrounds leading to different expectations regarding norms and behavior? So what constitutes hostile behavior, for example? And how do you make sure that Western paradigms don't dominate other perspectives on this? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's something that we've been discussing a lot, kind of within this group and within the wider Apex leadership. And so, kind of addressing that is one of the reasons that we are hoping to increase our collaborations with national committees who are going to be more familiar with the different paradigms and norms of the 73 countries that we have members from, to make sure that we aren't being too Northern Hemisphere dominated. And also, it sounds like one of the things with the Fieldwork Code of Conduct specifically that we just put out is that the whole document is written as a template. So it's not intended to be taken wholesale. It's intended to be taken by a group and then adapted to their specific needs. So it's really more of an outline than a like set in stone guideline, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm going to once again sort of use chair's privilege to ask a question myself, if that's okay. I think one of the fantastic things about the DEI group and the resources that you've put together is the fact that it started a couple of years ago, and it's something that it has been growing ever since. And I was wondering, I've realized that a lot of my colleagues, especially, are sort of becoming more aware of issues around diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion in the past couple of months, especially since sort of the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement surrounding George Floyd's death. And I was wondering if you've seen more people reach out and use those resources in that time, and how you envision sort of compiling those resources around issues like racial equality going forward. Not an easy question, I know.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't track things like the number of downloads or clicks on any of the resources. So I can't say for sure if they were accessed more in the last few months, but certainly we've had more internal conversations since really the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd's death in the last few months within Apex, and then certainly within our US Apex chapter. Yeah, I think that the events of the last few months have kind of highlighted to everyone the need to continue to have these conversations, and that there is a reoccurring role for the DEI group within Apex.
Thank you. I'd like to open the floor to any further questions for Carrie. I can't see any more in the chat, and that brings us to just after the hour. I think a break of maybe 5-10 minutes. We'll make it 10 minutes. We'll give everyone a chance to go away, get a coffee or a hot drink of your choice, stretch your legs a little bit, and then we will restart at, should we say 10 past? I think that would be a good shout. And we'll start with a poster presentation from Otto. So yeah, if I can expect everyone back at 10 past sharp. I realize that I can't see anyone's videos. You guys can only see me. But yeah, we'll begin again at 10 past the hour. Thank you. Yeah, Donna, do you want to test out your screen share just while we're taking this break? Because I realized we didn't get a chance to test it out earlier. Oops. Oh, that looks good. Yeah.
And I just hit slideshow, don't I? Oh,
Yeah.
no, slideshow. Wow. Excellent.
I can see that perfectly.
Thank you very much.
No worries, it's looking good. Fab.
Go grab that cup of tea.
Yeah, oh, I'm definitely going to go grab that cup of tea, I think.
All right, we'll be back. You.
Wonderful. I timed that perfectly, came back exactly 10 past. Yes, so thanks everyone who's still with us. Yeah, I think we should just get straight to it. So without further ado, Otto, I'd like invite you to share your screen.
Okay, just a sec.
Whenever you're
There
ready.
it is. Yep. I hope you can see it and I hope you can hear me. Hello, everybody. Our poster is based on an online workshop that took place on the 30th of March in the framework of the Arctic Science Summit Week. And some of the authors, co-authors, are here. I'm going through the poster, some parts of it, and you can see the names of some people who are present, like Gertie Sachsinger, Morgan Sieg, Carrie Harris. So thank you for joining this initiative and for co-designing and co-authoring this poster and paper. Main author is Dina Abdel Fattah. The poster features three main themes that we discussed during the workshops, highlighted here in light yellow. We discussed the image of heroic masculinity and how to go beyond it, the issue of field research and, particularly, career prospects for women and LGBTIQ, and the way gender influences research designs and research practices. A call for action summarizes what needs to be done, and I'm going to show this slide over the course of the next 2 minutes, while I'm going to comment on some particular aspects. When designing the poster, we decided to cut out the section on heroic masculinity and polar exploration and research. However, I take this as my starting point to explain where we've been coming from and where we are moving to. And I take the liberty to illustrate that by my own experience. Rather than simply condemning the old school and often military style expeditions, I see myself as a witness of its vestiges. For I was a PhD student in Britain at the Scott Polar Research Institute, also known as SPRI. And the public museum of this Scott Polar Research Institute was ripe with images of heroic masculinity in the late 1990s. I'm sure some of you have seen that. We also know that the British Antarctic Survey had difficulties admitting women to its expeditions well into the 1980s, and Morgan Sieg, co-author of this poster, has written about that. Now, the heroic masculinity stereotype was one impulse for assessing gender roles in polar research. It was not the only one. As social scientists working in the far north of Russia, some of us have come across countless performances of hypermasculinity in our fieldwork settings, emanating not from us researchers so much, but from some of our research partners or informants. And this cult of virility was of particular significance in research settings which are spatially confined, such as reindeer herders' tents or the long-distance train compartment in the company of oil and gas shift workers. It was in about 2008 when a group of social anthropologists started discussing gender-related research issues with regard to the Russian far north. However, I believe a moment of breakthrough was 10 years later in 2018, when different initiatives and networks across the circumpolar north got in contact with each other, discussing and advocating awareness of gender, non-binary and queer approaches, and also intersectionality in polar research. The workshop in March at the Arctic Science Summit Week and this poster have resulted from this, and fortunately, Arctic and Antarctic researchers now jointly discuss this issue. I think this is a magnificent opportunity for doing so. I already get to the takeaway message. We believe it's long overdue to speak about diversity, gender, queer, and also non-binary aspects of polar research, despite sometimes some condescending jokes of older colleagues who think this is a pretty pointless endeavor. But we believe it's just about the right time for this call for action. So please join our effort, and thanks for the attention. I hope I kept to the 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Otto. That was perfectly timed. Yeah, so I'd like to open the floor up to questions. I'm still digesting some of that, so.
I'm going to hold a bit privileged as well and ask the first question. Do you think that you were able to identify any kind of urgent priority areas? Because obviously most minority groups and things are affected by this kind of hypermasculinity, adventurous image of Antarctica. But were there any kind of groups that seemed more in need of assistance or support? And were there any obvious solutions that we could be employing straight away?
Yeah, that's a good question. I also invite others to comment on that, other co-authors of the paper. My personal take is it's not that easy to sort of single out groups that are more in need of support or less. And I believe my answer is based on the conviction that, for example, queer and LGBTQI, the project of making people equal partners in research is strongly rooted in a feminist, in a more general feminist project. And I believe that it is on these grounds, it's pretty impossible to actually say, well, should we rather give priority to that group or to this group? So in that sense, I believe that, yeah, I think these different kinds of, let me call that struggles, that they actually go hand in hand. And perhaps that's a first attempt at replying at this question, to this question.
Thank you, that's a good answer.
Yeah, and for the rest of the attendees, Gertie's just shared that the poster is open source, and there's a link to which you can download it. I really would encourage everybody to have a look at it because it's been circulating on social media over the past week, and it is just a fantastic poster. So thank you very much, Otto. Are there any more questions?
If we have time for a general discussion later on, I'm not sure if we do have time for that. I might bring up a topic which is a code of conduct, which was discussed during that workshop, and which is also mentioned on that poster. And the question will be a code of conduct, how helpful, necessary, and really urgent it is in different disciplines, in different scientific disciplines, because at the workshop there were some debates about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we actually will have time for a general discussion. There was a little bit of time put aside in case people went over, and we've had a couple of speakers who are no longer able to make this session to present and haven't been able to pre-record anything. So I'm hoping that towards the end of the session we might have 10 to 15 minutes for a more general discussion, and it would be lovely to hear more about that code of conduct, because I think that's something that can possibly tie together all of the different work being done by the presenters that we've had today. And I would also like to stress that following our second session, the workshop on the 4th of August, more details of which I will share later, we were hoping to have sort of a list of actionable items out of the sessions, sort of drawing from what we've learned today and also from the discussions that we'll be having on the 4th of August. And hopefully there'll be something concrete coming out of this, similar to sort of a code of conduct, and it would be lovely to have our attendees, both of this session and of the session on the 4th of August, to send out those recommendations as to what we can include. But we'll talk more about that later. I'd like to invite Donna Freighter now to talk about diversity through the Polar Horizons project. And Donna, just share your screen and whenever you're ready.
There we go. Thank you, Ikra. Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to be able to be here and talk to you today about the Polar Horizons project. Polar Horizons is one of a series of positive inclusion projects that we've been delivering from the Diversity in Polar Science initiative. The Diversity in Polar Science Initiative has been launched by the Polar Regions Department of the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Donna, can I just interrupt you for a second and ask you to go back one slide in your presentation so that...
Oh, it's black.
That's perfect.
There we go. Sorry, very sorry. So the Polar Regions Department of the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as part of marking the 200th anniversary of the discovery of the British Antarctic territories, and then in 1820 of the Antarctic continent, they have launched this initiative. And it's based on the firm belief that polar science and policy making will be enhanced by improving the diversity of our UK polar community. And that public engagement and understanding of the importance of the polar regions will have a greater impact if it is delivered through a wider diversity of voices. The Diversity in Polar Science Initiative aims to shine a spotlight on the current lack of diversity, as we only have 3% of our current researchers across the UK who come from a BAME background, compared to 16% in UK society and across the UK's higher education systems. We would like to simply increase the diversity in the UK polar community. The aims of the initiative draw on evidence that diversity in research leads to more innovation. And an objective of the engagement, and an objective is the engagement in polar research to then reflect the diversity in the UK and benefit science and benefit our wider community. So as I said, Polar Horizons is one of a series of positive inclusion projects. So we have had 2 trailblazing projects that have seen students from underrepresented groups without necessarily any prior engagement in polar science engage in events at the British Antarctic Survey. The first was in December, where we engaged students in a citizen science project, which was Seals from Space. And the second commenced in March this year, which was a longer term engagement program for UK STEM students from underrepresented groups, which we called Polar Horizons. We had 22 students who were masters and PhD students and early career researchers who identified as BAME, LGBTQ+, or disabled. And they applied into our program, and we matched them with host scientists and engineers on their science so that we could get students into polar science and they could share their interest in their science. Now, unfortunately, the COVID pandemic has necessitated a bit of a change in our original plan, but we have continued with our connection with these students with outreach programs, with talks from people that they would have been able to connect in with if we'd kept them at BAS for a longer period. The Polar Horizons project is proof that it takes a focused effort to change what we think of as traditional pathways for getting young STEM researchers into polar science. If we always do what we have always done, then we will get what we have always got. And there are a lot of people in the polar community across the UK and across the globe who believe that this is not the best outcome for polar science. We believe a more inclusive science, a more inclusive community will deliver better results, both for research, but also for our communities. So the Diversity in Polar Science Initiative will continue to work on the success of this positive inclusion project to understand what worked as we tried on a blank canvas to change the makeup of polar scientists, and we're going to set up resources onto the website which is currently hosted by the British Antarctic Survey. If you just search diversity on their website, our project page will come up. We're looking to put resources on that page that can support and attract people who are from the underrepresented minorities and encourage them into polar science, and also help them understand that we are looking for them to come and work and research in polar science, and that they will be welcome and that they will be part of the team. We have a couple of places there on the poster that have links as well with more information. If anyone would like to talk to me about the project we completed, or where else you think this sort of initiative should be looking, then I would love to hear from you. Thank you, Ikram. I think that's my time.
Thank you so much, Donna. Just as someone who's managed to now sit in on a few of these talks and these sessions, I think that what you're doing is really amazing, and I can see firsthand how inspired all of the different participants are, and how they're getting a chance to sort of really see a career in Antarctic research as something that is for them, and it's great. So that's my input. I'd like to open the floor to questions for Donna.
I'll start things off again. Donna came into, I know Donna, so it's kind of disclosure there, that Donna came into UK polar science with a background in Australian geology and gender studies. So I'm going to ask her what her first impressions of UK polar science were when she first walked through those doors at British Antarctic Survey.
Well, that's a very good question. I think I wanted the skidoo. There was a big bright yellow new skidoo in the hallway. I think I wanted that. But what was also there was a Pride in Polar banner. And that struck me, I think, on a couple of levels. I was probably surprised, coming from a STEM background where I'd been in plenty of workplaces. I don't think I'd seen a banner supporting LGBTQ plus populations so front and centre before. But it also made me feel welcome, and that inclusion was on the agenda, and that obviously that there was support for people from underrepresented groups to be in the building. I have been welcomed into the UK Polar element. I often joke that it's not as much about being a geologist here as it is about being the Aussie. But you know, there are a lot of people who are not only starting to talk about inclusion and how it's overdue, but also to put those efforts in. And I was interested in Otto's comment that this is the first time there's been a joint Arctic and Antarctic discussion regarding inclusion and diversity. So I find that very optimistic as well.
I'd like to ask a question, if it's all right, Dana. I just realised that during that presentation, we used the acronym BAME a few times, and being UK based, I know what that means, but perhaps just a point of clarification for those outside of the UK, if you could explain what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very relevant and always evolving part of the conversation. So as Hugh said, I'm a 20-year field geologist and decided to top that off with a year studying in London and studying a gender degree. So the hardest part of that study was basically an entirely new vocabulary. It was like learning a new language. And BAME is a word used in UK diversity inclusion discussions, and it stands for Black, Asian and minority ethnic. And over the last few weeks, there has been an increase in discussion regarding how, as individuals, our colleagues in polar science, they don't always feel that that is a positive representation and that it others them. But you have always in these discussions split sides where BAME has been recognised before as quite a positive terminology that does identify very different people inside the UK community, and it is a very UK specific element. And the other acronym is BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous or Person of Colour. And that is a different way of trying to highlight that there are very different issues, very different histories and elements and identities inside people who are represented in those communities of people of colour. So I always am happy to start conversations with people of colour by saying, please tell me if what I'm saying is not what you would like me to say, and please help me to understand how I can, continue to understand, because that is why I'm in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Donna. I think that attitude just highlights sort of like what we have kind of been talking about, this idea that there's nuance in these conversations, and also that you're not always going to get everything right, or what is right in one space might not be right in another. And I think it's great that we can address that in this space. Renuka's also shared in the chat the link to the website for the Polar Horizons project, so please do check that out. I am going to be sharing my screen for the next presentation. So Dr. Kathy Litt couldn't make it today, but she sent me a short video of her poster presentation, which I will now share with everybody else. And she said that she's happy for people to contact her via email if they have any comments or questions about the initiative. So bear with me. I have a lot of desktops open. So can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Right, I'll just...
Hello, my name is Kathy Licht, and I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues listed on this slide. I will describe the inclusive process we use to select our priority sites for the U.S. Antarctic program's next Deep Field Camp. The messages I have to share are, number one, with the right framework, it is possible to get a large group of interdisciplinary scientists from all career stages to work together and be guided by inclusivity. Our participants range from ecologists to geophysicists. Number two, we will be looking for international collaborations and cooperation when planning can begin for the next camp. Number three, our top priority sites are Northern Victorialand, in part because of its proximity to Wilkes Subglacial Basin, and the second priority is in the Southern Transantarctic Mountains. Both provide rich multidisciplinary research opportunities. The guiding principles that we used to be inclusive as possible were, number one, to be transparent about the process of selecting the sites. Number two, to select an organizing team or committee that is open-minded and willing to promote the interests of others, not just their own. And also to encourage participation by the next generation of leaders in polar sciences. This graphic summarizes our step-by-step process that I'll walk you through. First, we sent out a survey online to identify regions of Antarctica with the most scientific interest. The goal here was to maximize input from the entire Earth Sciences community. With that short list of sites in hand, we contacted individuals with experience and knowledge of particular sites and asked them to provide a broad background of the characteristics, including the geology, glaciology, biology, etc. This is no small task, and we encourage them to reach out to others in the community. Number three, we invited interested researchers to submit a poster that describes their research priorities and which areas are best suited to collect the new data. We prescribed the content through a template and asked those to be submitted ahead of time. Then at the workshop we held, we began with a poster session in which researchers were sorted by discipline. After that, the researchers compiled a list of research themes for their discipline, which was presented for the whole group. That was followed by an interdisciplinary poster session to raise awareness of the priorities for the other disciplines and to look for opportunities for collaboration. Next, the breakout groups synthesized research priorities by site, and these were presented to the entire group and discussed. The final step was creation of a matrix so that each site could be rated by its potential to address the themes identified by the disciplinary groups. Numeric values were assigned by consensus and summed to create a ranked list. Together, these strategies really created an inclusive process. Early career scientists and first-time participants in the workshop said they were pleasantly surprised at how constructive and objective the process was. I welcome you to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Yes, so that is Kathy's presentation, and she was really she really encouraged people to get in touch if they wanted to hear more about how that process went and the different steps to that process. She sadly couldn't join us, but she was really keen to see what would come out of today. And with that in mind, I know that we have about 10, possibly even 15 minutes free, with a couple of our presenters not being able to make it today. So I think going back to the point you made earlier, Otto, about a code of conduct, I'd like to hear more about what you had to say. I feel like that'd be a great jumping off point for a discussion.
Well, thank you. I think what I'm going to say may be a bit uncomfortable for some, but my point is that fewer codes of conduct are important indeed to reduce and stop sexual harassment and also sexual assaults. However, from the point of view of social sciences, and here I'm speaking of social anthropology in particular, and in the Arctic in particular, a fieldwork code of conduct is problematic because actually it is the social scientist who has to learn the local code of conduct from the research partners in a given community. So we cannot simply walk into a northern community with a fully predefined code of conduct of ourselves. To be sure, social anthropologists and others follow and should follow research ethics and the obligations that come with it. But simultaneously, we need to account for the people we work with, their intentions and their happiness and also grief sometimes, and also the ways of communicating among those that we live with during our fieldwork. And perhaps this question requires further discussion if a code of conduct which is designed, for example, a research station in the Antarctic can easily be transferred to a research setting of social sciences in let me call that simply the Northern Hemisphere or the Arctic. Thank you.
I'd like to kind of jump in there as well. This kind of cultural differences and things are really important to take into account. So recently a conference for early career earth scientists was announced for North Africa, so Morocco. And that opens up a whole new area in terms of involvement of underrepresented geographical areas in science, but then causes issues for people who essentially become illegal if they enter those environments, but also for women entering a North African environment where there are very different rules on how women should dress and how they'll be treated if they don't behave in certain ways and things like that. That although all of these problems we've talked about going hand in hand, sometimes trying to help with one issue can cause bigger issues for another part of the equation. So I think these codes of conduct and everything else need to be flexible enough to account for that. And one of the things that Mike Pryor-Jones from, I think he's at Cardiff University, has done is presented on risk assessments instead of codes of conduct. So you assess each situation individually based on how much risk there is for women going to one country versus another country for conferences or field work, for example, or you look at LGBT rights in the countries you'll be traveling through to get to Antarctica, and you look at all of those elements and you consider minorities and underrepresented groups where legal systems may apply differently to the white cis male, which everything is currently based on. So we don't currently include any what become vulnerable groups but aren't vulnerable groups in our classic way of thinking about it. So a lot of risk assessments will take into account if you have a health condition or you are elderly, but as an LGBT person, I become vulnerable if I go to certain countries. I become at risk in those countries, but I go to other countries and I'm not. So I think this case-by-case basis is really important.
Absolutely. I think, Hugh, you've raised a really important point there as well. And Carrie, if you can, I'd invite you to also weigh in, because I think you touched on this with the DEI code of conducts that you were talking about, and how to have it as more of a suggestions as opposed to something set in stone.
Yeah, this is Carrie again. Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, and something that I would love to hear from other people on this call if they have suggestions for ways of, I think trying to balance both the need or the desire to have something in writing that you can distribute to people before fieldwork begins to make sure that everyone is on the same page, versus having a response that is able to be flexible to meet the needs of each particular situation. So I will post the link to our code of conduct in the chat in a second, since that is up on the Apex website now, but we're very open to feedback and would love to hear from people on this call if you have suggestions or ideas for a way to improve it.
It might be good to put you in touch with Mike Pryor-Jones actually with this risk assessment idea, because it is about things that they should be doing for your safety and well-being anyway, and including these additional elements. So putting the onus on the institutions to make sure that their staff are safe and well at all times.
Yeah, that would be great. That sounds like really interesting and important work.
We've just got a question through on the Q&A asking, can the conduct of senior researchers supervising early career researchers be regulated by the same code of conduct we might use for polar research in general, or are those separate issues? Sort of thinking specifically about the vulnerability of early career researchers and this idea of being dependent on supervisors for your project or for your career progression. Would anyone like to weigh in on that? Because I think that's quite a weighty topic, but a good one to jump into.
I think if nobody else has got, I think it's really important that we understand that there is a great deal of this that goes unsaid because of those reasons that you said just now. And we don't have, well, institutionally, I don't know of any institution that allows you to report incidents on behalf of other people as you would like if there was an accident or an incident or a near miss with health and safety. So institutes aren't taking this risk in the same way they do for accidents or sort of problems with machinery, for example. So there is no way of even knowing how much of a problem there is in a lot of these things. So I think that covers everybody from senior scientists right down to early career scientists bullying each other, for example. So I think none of these problems should be taken in isolation. I think what's more important is to have a way of dealing with issues when they come up, to make sure that everything is dealt with fairly and that people are protected until there is evidence gathered and things, because, and that importantly goes for the person who's reporting it as well. You need to be able to raise an issue without feeling that your career is going to be impacted, because that's what puts most people off from doing any kind of reporting at the moment. No student should feel that if they lose one supervisor, they can't complete their studies. There shouldn't be that shouldn't be a thing hanging over people, but at the moment it is, so people don't report.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question as well? I I think what I'd add to that as well is, as an early career researcher myself, as someone who is in the process of writing up my PhD thesis, I've realized over time how lucky I am to be in the department that I'm in, which as history of science departments go, is fairly racially and diverse in terms of gender and queerness as well, which I'm now realizing is very, very rare. And perhaps in some ways I'd been in a bit of a bubble for the first couple of years of my PhD, being in such an inclusive space. But I have realized the horror stories you hear as a PhD student specifically about which researchers to avoid, who tends to be a bully. And it's this idea that so much of this information is passed around through whisper networks. And in some ways that can be useful. And in other ways, I think it's quite a shame, because it does show that there's a lack of accountability that has led people to pass on information on who to avoid or which situations could be potentially dangerous through whisper networks as opposed to more formal channels. We have another question now from the chat saying, this discussion's been quite focused on fieldwork, but how do you all feel about inclusiveness within the international initiatives? Maybe someone more advanced in the work to foster inclusion and diversity than others. Would anyone like to weigh in on that?
I'm going to say something again because I can't help but not say it. I've been watching Donna's project grow, for example, and that is within the UK community. And one of the things we learned working with Donna on this project was that not everybody's on the same page in terms of the use of language and understanding the issues. And it's one of the things we're having to do within British Antarctic Survey that will be hopefully sort of rolled out wider, is to just start the conversation about language and what it's okay to say and what it's not okay to say, and what words are okay to use and which ones aren't okay to use, and broaching topics such as sexuality, sex and gender being different but all part of the same person, and all those sorts of things. If you're a straight white male who's lived in a straight white male world of Antarctic research, for example, for a long time, just bringing those topics to the horizon so people can see that they exist. Because if you're living in a bubble which is really underrepresented in terms of minorities, you might not meet people in your day-to-day working life who are a minority, or know that you're meeting someone who's a minority if it's an invisible one, and therefore the language used may be inappropriate or just clumsy. And I think that sort of all our institutions should be trying to bring everybody up to the same page before you can start an international discussion, because Donna had to explain the terminology she was using, which is standard UK terminology, before it was understandable to everybody. So it's, as well as educating ourselves on what's the appropriate terminology within our own countries, we then have to go and do it for the international stage in a different way again. So it's a lot of learning involved before we can have these conversations, I think.
Thanks, Hugh. This is Renuka here. I think it's quite important to also understand that when you have international initiatives, they're normally coming from, they're defined by some purpose. Now that purpose may not be completely exhaustively inclusive. So like, for example, we have the network called Women in Polar Science. It started off by trying to get equity for women who are working in polar sciences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't work with other networks that deal with other aspects of inclusivity. So understanding where initiatives are coming from gives us a step to try and foster further inclusion and diversity by working with other networks and other initiatives that are existing in that space.
I would have a comment if possible.
Please do comment.
Yeah, thank you. So this is also about Joanna's question, inclusiveness within international initiatives. And now I'm thinking about institutions, and since we've discussed several examples from the United Kingdom in particular, my impression overall is that over the last 20, 30 years, things have been moving forward in the direction that I think all of us want to see. And if I think about institutions and leadership of women in top positions, some of the biggest, let me call that biggest partners in polar research, Arctic and Antarctic, are women. And I believe some 20 years ago, that would not have been possible. And still, what bothers me, and I don't know if anybody has a good answer or some insight into that, what is usually called the glass ceiling, that women don't get into the upper echelons of research and being responsible for leading research initiatives. To what extent do you think this has changed to the better, and where do you think this glass ceiling is still there? Because at that workshop in March, we discussed that on the example of marine sciences and marine biology, fishery. And it seems that in some countries with some research stations, the glass ceiling is all there, yeah, and in other cases, it seems not to be there. So do you folks have any ideas on that?
Is there anyone who'd like to weigh in on that?
I can go for the first comment. Thanks, Otto. That was a really interesting aspect. I think Antarctic science or polar science in general has been really good for giving us quite a few female leaders. However, I think within the organizations, if you still look, diversity isn't, that was just the first step. Let's put it that way. Instead of going negative, I'll say it positively. Having women serve as leaders of these organizations is just the first step. The diversity within these organizations are definitely, we still have quite a way to go. Let's put it that way. So I think, even in your presentation, when you did your poster, I think you suggested that understanding that there's a lack of diversity is the first step. And I think that would probably be my response to your comment, that we are getting there, but there's a long way to go yet.
Yeah, there's a question for you in the chat, Renuka, saying thanks for your comments. I'd like to hear about your experiences working with an international organization, about the challenges and the opportunities in cooperation between different national programs, sort of building on Adrian's presentation earlier. So if you'd like to take that question.
Thank you, Justina. It's been an interesting experience because I kind of intersect quite a few different aspects that we've discussed today. I'm not European to begin with. I kind of identify half with Europe by now, but the other half is firmly based in Asia and India. So that's one aspect that I had to deal with when I moved to Europe more than 20 years ago now. But I think coming from a background which is international in general helped me quite a bit personally in working with international organizations. And I kept thinking in the beginning, if I could make that move, why can't other people understand that there's so many different things that, there's so many different cultures and so many different opportunities around the world. And I think I agree with what I think Otto was saying, this, that in about 30 years, we've already seen changes. And I would say my 20 years in polar research, I've definitely seen changes. I think understanding that there's a basic difference in cultural aspects, even within Europe where I work now, even within Europe, which we would consider as quite similar and homogeneous, it's not. Northern European perspectives are very different to Southern European perspectives. So understanding that there is this difference and then going into a situation makes a huge difference. If you look at Europe as a homogeneous whole, you will lose a lot of opportunities for getting cooperation. And I think Justina will also have quite a lot of perspectives on this, if you'd like to comment, because she also works with the Swedish Polar Research Council. So she's also got a lot of experience in getting cooperation working within different national programs.
I don't know, do you want me to say something?
Yeah, go for it. Come on.
Okay. Thanks, Renuka. I just kind of wanted to expand the discussion by asking this question from you, because in terms of national cultures and international cooperations, I found Adrian's presentation really interesting. I started to think about our work because we manage the Antarctic research stations in Dronning Maudland, which is another region, again, where you have different nations coming together with different cultures and different national histories. And of course, in terms of the European Polar Board, there are also discussions where you can see this national cultures. You find opportunities, but they take, Renuka can talk to this may be, I don't want this to become a discussion between the two of us, but it takes a long time, and then people forget things, and then you go to the next meeting, and then there are these different clusters that form because there are different cultures and interest and histories, because it's, even if it's just science, the national programs prioritize specific kind of science and specific kind of inclusion or exclusion based on what is the national, in this case, in my case would be in Sweden, what is the national program for vision for science for the next 20 or next 10 years is what they're going to publish. So those also kind of science policy and then national cultures for the scientists who are in the field influence that as well, which I think we got a little bit into in Adrian's presentation. And if you have any comments, I don't know if you're still on the call, Adrian, it would be great to hear that. Thanks.
I think Adrian had to go join the SCAR business meeting, which is one of the reasons why we had him present early. But I'm sure if anyone wants to get in touch and hear more about his research, it'd be great to see how he'd weigh into this. I'm very aware of the fact that we are almost at 2 hours. And so as much as I would love to continue this conversation, all I have to say is that we will be continuing conversations like this on the 4th of August at 3 p.m. till 6 p.m. UTC. You can find that session. It's on the SCAR 2020 online website. If you register for that, all of the details for how to join that session will be sent out to you. We have a panel discussion on inclusivity, intersectionality, a few more of the oral and poster presentations that we couldn't squeeze into this session today. A couple of breakout discussions on issues around fieldwork and also institutional change. We hope you'll be able to join us for those. It's very much a session where you can drop in and out as you please, as it is 3 hours long. And we're very excited as well to be able to have a panel discussion towards the end of the session, in which we'll be inviting various leaders in Antarctic institutions to come and talk about the various initiatives that they are championing, that they are seeing for the future, and that they are sort of working towards improving diversity, equality and inclusion in Antarctic research specifically. We hope you'll join us for that. And I think all that's left now is for Renuka to provide some closing comments. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's been a really fantastic session.
Oh, before Renuka does, can I just say thank you to ICRA and all of the organising team on behalf of the panelists and participants, because it's been a really good session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh and ICRA. I think I just join in to say the thanks to all of my co-organizers, Morgan Sayek, ICRA, Alex, and myself have brought you this session today. And for the workshop next week, we have a couple of additional participants, like Donna is co-organizing, as well as Meredith Nash. So I look forward to that workshop as well. I hope you all can join us for that. I'd just like to close with a few lessons that I've noted down that we can all take forward. I think the very first one is that we have to accept that there are barriers and obstacles, and they may be very different when you're looking at them from very different perspectives. So you can have aspects like language, gender, career stage, geographical location, and so many others. We have to ensure that there is some information, knowledge, and training provided for equity and inclusion in bigger organizations. If we have information like that available, people can make themselves aware. We have to work with networks, and these are amazing for providing you the support. And even one person working with a network can make a huge difference. And I think I'll end with a comment, a quotation that Donna used in her presentation. If we always do what we have always done, then we will always get what we have always got. So we need to move forward from that, use today's situation as a benchmark, and work forward towards progress. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining in, and hope to welcome you on Wednesday next week.
Thanks again, everyone. Like Renuka said, hope to see you on Wednesday. If you can make it, please do share with your networks if there's anyone that you think might be interested in the session. And please have a great rest of your day wherever you've joined us from. Thank you. I'll just end this session now. Take care, everybody.